And of course, it was timed to the 10th anniversary of the Confederation Bridge. And I had various chapters in this book. I had a book about Singapore and Malaysia. In the case of Singapore and Malaysia, the main effect of the bridge was on Malaysia, not on Singapore, even though Singapore was the island. In fact, Singapore has developed strategically a big city now, very close to the straits with Singapore, in order to exploit even more the advantages of being linked to this thriving dynamic hub, which happens to be on an island. So this is these are the parameters that I'm playing around with. How do they impact, what do they tell us about the Atlantic region? Well, perhaps very briefly, I know I'm simplifying things here, and I apologize for that. I don't have time to go into enormous detail. But simply, perhaps, if we look at the trajectory, the economic political trajectory of Atlantic Canada, we find that deep down there are two main significant sources of economic wealth, simply put. One is what I call natural resources, wood, fish, potatoes in the case of PEI, right, agricultural products. Those that are based on, that have to do with tourism, for instance, on one hand. And on the other hand, fiscal transfers, equalization payments, transfer payments. You know the big issue between the Danny Williams government in Newfoundland and the Harper government, right? Of course it's a big issue. It's absolutely key to the way in which that particular province sees itself as developing. However, looking up, and I put this down before the last budget was announced, and if I'm not mistaken, not a single word about the Atlantic Gateway in the recent budget, which is significant in its absence. The Atlantic Gateway project, of course, has the potential of transforming this region, but of course not the whole region. And Halifax, I think, is extremely well placed to benefit from such a model, but of course by elimination, anywhere else would not, I think, not as much certainly. So if anything, an Atlantic Gateway project may accelerate the urbanization and concentration that is already taking place in this region. Okay? Remember, we're talking about Atlantic Canada. Total population of Atlantic Canada is less than the city of Montreal. Total population of Atlantic Canada is going down in relation to the rest of the country. I think at the moment it's about 7%, or just over 7%. It's a vicious cycle. The less people in the area, the less political clout they have, certainly in the federal places of power, right? So this is serious, I think. So how do these island spaces survive? I'm going to discuss very briefly three models of so-called development for small island economies. I think they have a resonance with rural spaces, and I think they have lessons for us as well. The first one, they're all explained by acronyms. The first one is called MIREB. This goes back to the mid-80s. It was developed by two New Zealand economists, Jeff Bertram and Roy Waters. This is a model of development that's based on mainly two forms of transactions. One is migration. Migration is key to many of these small spaces. People leave, people feel obliged to their home, people find good jobs, jobs that pay relatively much better to anything they would have had they stayed at home. So in order to pay back to their homeland, to their families, their households, they send money back. Right? There are some countries in the world that actually plan to export their people. When I was in the Philippines, I visited a nursing school. This is the right building to talk about this, right? A nursing school for export. So you don't just train nurses in medical care. You train them in English. You train them in Western culture. You train them in the way in which they're supposed to work in a Western hospital, because that's where they're going, and that's where they go. The amount of transfers that the Filipino government gets every year is equivalent to the total government spending, the total government budget. Mexico is the same. There are so many countries that survive on remittances. So that's one part of the equation. The other part of the equation is aid. So while remittances are transferred directly to households, They bypass the state, usually. Aid is usually channeled through the state, the local state, whatever that may be, right? And through that aid, the bureaucracy is financed. So the public sector, government jobs are basically financed with money coming in from somewhere else. And that possibly rings a bell here as well, right? The ability to finance employment, federal or provincial, through money that's not generated locally. Second model, the site model, developed by Jerry McElroy, who's a US professor of economics. The small island tourism economies. Certain parts of the world, in particular the Caribbean, survive almost exclusively on tourism receipts, right? As much as 75% of their local gross national product is derived from tourism receipts. That's phenomenal, right? And of course, this is not necessarily a sustainable practice. There's so much leakage from these economies. There's so much input that has to be brought in from somewhere else that nevertheless, however, it's one of the few activities that these places can do. And it touches, of course, with the politics of dreams and the whole myth and branding of islands as spaces that can sell paradise. Edens without apples, as they sometimes are referred to. The third model, which I have humbly thrown into the ring there, I call it the profit model. This is based on, rather than on the economic activity, I base it more on the political capacities. From my point of view, what is much more important is not so much the revenue generation aspect of development, but the mechanisms which make it work. The mechanisms in themselves are the ones that I think have the long-term potential for determining where a place can go, because it is the place deciding where it wants to go, or where it can go depending on the opportunities of the time, right? The smaller the economy, the more likely is it that that economy can switch to tap opportunities as they arise. And therefore we have people, absolutely key, human capital. The management of local resources, including resources for environmental benefits, crafting nature reserves, crafting heritage parks. The overseas orientation. For example, paradiplomacy. What is your presence overseas? Do you have a presence overseas? Do you have an honorary consul somewhere? Do you have people waving your flag? I don't mean the national flag, the local flag, the provincial flag, right? So that's why it's called paradiplomacy. It's not diplomacy. This is becoming a big thing out there, right? Finance capital. Offshore finance has been very good business for many small economies, because one of the advantages of smallness is that you can reduce your rate of tax, and in so doing maximize your tax revenue. It sounds like a contradiction, but it actually works, because the lower your tax rate, the more competitive you become, and the more likely is that you're going to expand your tax base, and therefore the net income is going to increase. And finally, transport. Absolutely key again. Jurisdictions have threatened independence because a certain airline was thinking of withdrawing its service, for example. Bermuda. When British Airways threatened to stop its London-Hamilton route, the Bermudans said, okay then, we'll get independent, we'll have our own airline. We can't survive without that link. And of course, British Airways still flies into Bermuda. I call this governmentality. For those of you who are familiar with Michel Foucault, this is a term that I borrow from him. It's about the powers of the state that are no longer built and premised on determining its own survival. Once a state, always a state. That seems to be the case. There have only been 2 states in the last 100 years that have no longer remained states. And they are South Yemen and Zanzibar, by the way, just in case you were thinking of asking me. So all the other states that have existed continue to exist. This is called extentism, right? The international community has an obligation to make sure that you survive. So once that's covered, your bases are covered, you can think about flexing your governmental muscles, preferably tapping into resources and economies that are not under your jurisdiction.